Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the topic, the key priorities for customer identification and monitoring in 2014. Before we begin the webinar, I just have some housekeeping announcements. There is a Q&A button to the left of the screen. If you have any problems throughout the webinar or would like to ask a question at the end, please type them into this box and we will do our best to help. If you have any comments or thoughts you'd like to share during the presentation, you can tweet us using the Twitter widget to the left of the screen. If you'd like to send us an email during or after the presentation, then please click on the Contact Us widget at the bottom of the page. We will open the group chat 15 minutes before the end of the webinar, so if you'd like to continue the conversation, please use this facility to network with your peers. And finally, before you leave the webinar, we would greatly appreciate it if you could take the time to fill out the exit survey in the red widget at the bottom of the page, as we are always looking for ways to improve and add value to our webinars. So I now pass you over to the host for today's webinar, Gary Duxbury.
Okay, thanks very much. Welcome everybody on this webinar today. I don't know if it's afternoon for most people, but whatever time of day it is, thank you very much for joining us. We had over 1,000 people subscribe to today's event, so Rowan and Brian, no pressure, and look forward to, as usual, a lively conversation. An introduction from myself. I head up the transactional monitoring business here at Thomson Reuters. Compared to my two colleagues here, my mere 12 years in this space doesn't seem to be enough pedigree, but hopefully I can still add things to the proceedings. Rowan, who is sat on my left as it happens, Rowan is a 30-year veteran and still looking good in the areas of legal and regulatory compliance. Rowan, if you haven't come across him in all his writings and publications over the years, he's a legal consultant and former fraud squad detective at Scotland Yard, New Scotland Yard, and has taken up a number of positions over 10 years working for two leading law firms in the City of London as a criminal justice consultant. Rowan now maintains his own specialist consulting practice, providing commentary and insight, and he's recently been part of a UN role as an expert panel member focusing on financial asset oversight in the West Africa region. So welcome, Rowan. Thank you for joining us today. Brian, again, known to many people, has the head role of Global Head of Anti-Money Laundering Service for KPMG, and he is head of the UK Financial Service Forensic Team at KPMG. 18 years experience in this space, 4.5 years as head of the department in the FSA's Enforcement Division, and overseeing some of the early anti-money laundering cases under the Financial Services and Markets Act. Brian has been a key member of the Serious Organised Crime Agency Vetted Committee and the Wolfsburg Group's of Investment Banking Working Group. So the format that we have today is that both Rowan and Brian will give a brief presentations, and then we've got a number of questions that we're going to push out to you, and we'll be looking for some of these responses and using those to facilitate what I hope will be a lively discussion for everyone. So Rowan, if I can hand over to you to start this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gary. And just echoing Gary's remarks, a very, very good, warm welcome to all of you who've checked in to take part in this. The title, The Key Priorities for Customer Identification and Monitoring, gives us a very, very wide canvas on which to work. And because we have limited time, I thought what I would do is to try and tie this down to some important key points. And I've taken as my theme, if you like, the latest thematic review from the British financial regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, whose recent review on anti-money laundering and anti-bribery and corruption systems and controls contains within it some very, very important pointers. In fact, when I read it for the first time, I don't know about you, Brian, but I was actually quite I was quite shocked in a funny kind of way that even today we are still talking about really basic failings in terms of where financial institutions are simply not getting the most basic important features right. And particularly when we come down to talk about customer identification and the monitoring of transactions. I mean, this is where we truly are in room 101 as far as getting best practice compliance is correct. For example, we were very clear that the FCA was very clear. Firms that they reviewed could not provide evidence to demonstrate the effectiveness of senior management oversight and challenge. At the end of the day, the buck stops with the senior management, who are the people who are controlling and delivering the institutional policy. And if when a regulator comes in and says, look, we simply cannot find the evidence to show how effective senior management oversight is, well, I'm sorry, guys, but we're in a difficult situation here. And so what I've done is I've come back with this strap line, which is very dear to my heart, which is to think all the time. If you're asking yourself, where am I best focused to start delivering these responses, to start thinking about the risk-based approach. And I'm going to hammer this point home over the next 10 minutes because I believe it's the risk-based approach that actually helps us to get to a positive way of providing best practice compliance. The next point that the FCA identified were that anti-money laundering and anti-bribery and corruption issues were, and by the way, when we talk about AML, we're also talking about countering the financing of terrorism. They were dealt with primarily as a compliance matter rather than as part of a proactive risk management process. And I think this is where we, in a sense, we may be losing the plot. As they say themselves, the failure to properly identify and assess risk often led to weaknesses in customer due diligence and ongoing monitoring of business relationships. This failure to identify and assess the risks that the customers present us, not only the customers themselves, but of course the three important basics of the risk-based approach: the customers, the geographies in which they're operating, and the products with which they're engaging. Again, a failure to think about the risk-based approach has resulted in this inability to identify and assess risks. The third issue that the FCA talks about, firms had inconsistent or absent controls to assess, classify, and record risks posed by new customers. And that meant that the enhanced due diligence and enhanced ongoing monitoring was sometimes not being carried out for high-risk customers. Now, every single one of us listening to this process knows that in the modern day and age, we've just been talking about it ourselves here, in the modern day and age, the correspondent relationship between banks on a global basis is absolutely primarily determined by the ability to identify the needs for enhanced due diligence and the ability to classify and record the risk posed by customers. This is ultimately where we come down to when we're talking about the need for good client identification and the need for the ability to proactively monitor the business that they are bringing to the institution. Because without these abilities to control, assess, classify and record the risks, again, the institution is leaving itself wide open to increasingly aggressive and draconian regulatory interference. We're also looking at one of the issues which is dear to my heart. Some firms considered that the long-standing nature of some business relationships alone was a satisfactory substitute for keeping customer due diligence information up to date. You couldn't be more wrong. One of the things that we know, certainly from the law enforcement community, that we have discovered over the years is where a terrorist organization is looking to create a relationship with a financial institution. They are prepared to play the long game. And when they are forming institutional relationships, in many, many cases, they will put money to sleep for many, many years before they need to come back and use it. And of course, if you get a situation where you've got a relationship with a client and this client is you're perfectly happy with this client and they trot along in a very nice, quiet way, year in, year out, the risk that you start to consider that this long-standing relationship somehow exonerates you from a need to go back and review the relationship at a reasonable period of time would be a very important mistake. It's very interesting. Albert Einstein once said, I think it's something worth remembering, Albert Einstein once said, in life, as in love, it's sometimes necessary to hang a question mark over that which we have taken for granted for so long. Now, I'm not going to suggest that we look at it from the emotional perspective, but certainly I would urge you to look at it from a constructive client relationship, which is to say, hang on a minute, we've been doing business with XYZ for so long, but we've never really looked closely at them. Go back and review them, review the relationship, and put them back under the microscope. And you may be saying, oh, we're so busy, we haven't got time. It pays dividends. Another thing the FCA discovered was that some firms failed to take adequate steps to establish, verify, and document, very important, the legitimacy of the source of funds and the source of wealth to be used in business relationships for high-risk customers. Now, this is a very, very key issue and a very important problem. Only this week I was tutoring a young PhD student who is looking at anti-money laundering issues, a specific area of best practice. And he himself had worked at a major global bank. And he told me that despite the fact that he as an analyst had done important work to identify serious risk areas on particular clients, when it came to handing those findings to senior management, all too often the shrug went in, the shoulders lifted and said, well, look, there's so much money involved here, we're going to take the risk anyway. This is a very, very dangerous perspective, a very dangerous position to adopt. And indeed, we know that some banks have fallen foul of this kind of issue in the past and have paid the price very, very, very dearly. Another finding, most firms fail to demonstrate adequate systems and controls for assessing bribery and corruption risks in relation to dealing with and monitoring third-party relationships, such as relationships with agents or introducers. I think this is an issue that has for too long been quietly, perhaps, if not overlooked, has certainly been put on the back burner. But I think everything we've looked at in these last few slides comes back, and I would urge you to come back and think again and again about making sure that your risk-based approach is up to date, is fully reviewed, is fully analyzed. And it needs to be maintained, monitored, and made use of at every stage of the business process, because it determines the appetite the firm has towards risk in every compartment with regard to every customer, in every jurisdiction, and in every currency. At the end of the day, the risk-based approach and the risk-based document and the policies that you enunciate provide you with a series of pointers with which to determine the way in which your systems and controls are going to work. I'm sure there are people out there saying, okay, you've hit us up with the compliance issues. Where is the commercial imperative here? Well, I can tell you from my own personal experience, working with institutions over the last many, many years, that actually good customer knowledge gives you really up-to-date, monitored customer knowledge, gives you the ability to cross-sell and upsell new financial products of which your clients themselves may not be aware. And there are seriously good commercial opportunities there. At the same time, making sure that you understand and you know where your risk appetites lie, enable your technology consultants and managers to be able to map your risk policies and your risk appetite as closely as possible to the technology that you will be using to calibrate the level of risks that you are prepared to accept. Because what this does in your transaction monitoring systems is it enables you to minimize the number of false positives that get kicked out. And I'm sure that there are technology managers listening into this who say, you're tearing their hair out saying, it's those false positives that drive me crazy every day. And we can share that pain with you. And you can do a great deal to minimize that by making sure that your risk-based approach is up to date. So I'm going to take a back seat now and pass this over to Brian, my friend and colleague, to take it on further, hopefully leaving time for questions later on. Brian?
Just before we pass over to that's perfectly right. Rowan, thank you very much. Delivered with passion as ever, which is great. And I think just before we sat down to share this information with everyone today, we were talking about, we felt a little bit guilty, or I was prodding people and saying, the risk-based approach has been around for a long time. It's not a new catchphrase. We get, 0 points for originality. And yet, just to focus everyone who's listening today, that this is an output from a review which took place in October of last year. So this is recent information on a topic which, to a number of people, may seem quite old hat, but it's the same issues just being recycled here. And it is the importance from a compliance officer is if something isn't addressed, it still needs to be addressed no matter how long it's been around for. So when you're putting your questions in, please do bear that in mind. Right, Brian, over to yourself.
Thank you very much. And just one comment on that, actually, before I start on mine, which is that the report that we've just been talking about was in relation to the asset management sector. And there may be people on the call that are thinking, well, actually, this is not representative of the industry as a whole. But actually, if you look at the FCA's report, or FSA report as it was then, in 2010 in relation to high-risk relationships, there were some pretty damning conclusions there, and that was focused on the banks. So if there is anyone there thinking this is only a particular industry sector and doesn't apply elsewhere, then you'd be wrong. So I'm going to just talk for a few minutes on our 2014 Global AML Survey, and in particular in relation to the things that impact on the subject of this WebEx, which is about client identification and monitoring. This is our fourth Global AML Survey that we've done over a period of 10 years. And we had over 300 responses from 48 different countries. Two of the headline findings, so the first one really around the focus on anti-money laundering, was pretty striking actually in relation to the senior management focus on AML issues. What we discovered when we did our survey in 2010, which was obviously towards the back end or the beginning of the end of the financial crisis, I guess. The senior management interest in anti-money laundering really reduced down quite a bit. It was 62% globally, and it was 55% in Europe. It's now gone up to 88%, which is way in excess of what it was even before the financial crisis, when there were a lot of big fines at that point. And when you take into account that previous surveys have all been in banking, which is generally considered to be more mature from an AML perspective than some of the other financial services industries, we had asset managers and insurers in here for the first time who have tended to consider their business to be lower risk. So you might have expected the number to go down rather than up, and 88% is a pretty striking number in terms of the interest. In terms of the other area we look at, which is the cost of compliance, a regular theme throughout our surveys has been, we always ask how much people have spent, whether expenditure has increased over the prior 3 years to the survey, and whether they think it's going to go up over the next 3 years post the survey. And what we find each time is the prediction of how much anti-money laundering expenditure is going to go up from the previous survey is always exceeded by what they then say it actually did go up previously, and this year was no different. So the prediction was a 40% increase when we did our survey in 2011, and the actual increase that was disclosed from our recipients was 53%, and it's 53% from a pretty high level. We've recently done some research based on a number of surveys of expenditure and a number of analyses of expenditure, and our estimate of the total expenditure globally on anti-money laundering by financial institutions, and now increasingly non-financial institutions as well, we think that's going to exceed $10 billion within the next 2 to 3 years, which is an incredible amount of money spent by the industry, and I think it completely dwarfs the amount of money spent by governments around the world on trying to fight the same thing. So the financial services industry has become the policeman for anti-money laundering rather than governments doing it themselves. But if we then look at where those areas of expenditure are greatest, the interesting thing of direct relevance to the discussion we're having today is the top two are in relation to transaction monitoring and in relation to KYC and keeping KYC information up to date. Now, when you talk about ongoing monitoring, which is the definition in the money laundering regulations in the UK, it's the definition in the European Money Laundering Directive, and it's replicated in many jurisdictions around the world. Ongoing monitoring includes two things. It's keeping KYC information up to date, and it's monitoring transactions. So those two things are reflected in these two high scores. Transaction monitoring has been the highest area of AML investment and expenditure in every survey that we've done, 4 surveys over 10 years. And the worrying thing is the satisfaction with those has reduced over the period. So firms are spending more money on transaction monitoring than anything else, and they're getting less and less satisfied with what it's producing. And I'll come on to a few more details of those in a minute. In relation to keeping KYC information up to date, historically there's been many problems at firms in terms of getting their onboarding right and getting the right KYC information. There's been historic problems around retaining that information and being able to find it when they need it again in future. But even those banks that have solved both of those two problems are now having a lot of difficulty in how to put in an ongoing review process that covers all of their customers, because the scale of it is many times what you need for onboarding, which is already a large number of people to keep every client and customer up to date. So if we just look at the 3 particular areas that we're covering today, so initial KYC, KYC refresh and review, and transaction monitoring. Firstly, on KYC, 70% of respondents had been subject to a regulatory visit on KYC. So that's 70% globally of financial institutions where the regulator has come in and looked at KYC. So if you think KYC is kind of yesterday's problem, that clearly says that it isn't. As I've said, it's the second largest area of AML expenditure, and the area in particular that people still struggle with, even though the numbers suggest that there's a lot more focus and the numbers are much better, is in relation to PEPs and high-risk customers. They continue to be a focus of regulators, they continue to be a problem, and as we've seen, as Rowan was saying, one of the big issues is about making the right risk decisions and making sure that risk decision is properly documented. If you don't have your risk decision documented, it didn't happen. That's how the regulators look at it. So they will come in and they will say, we think this account should be high risk. You will say, I've got it as medium risk, but I don't have any documentation which shows what decision we made at the time. The answer to that is, they're right, you're wrong. So you must have it documented in order to justify your decision making at the time you made the decision. It's no good trying to recreate that afterwards. In relation to refresh and review, I said it's still a major challenge. Even for those that have got onboarding right, this is a major challenge. We see many firms still wandering blindly from one remediation to another. They have multi-year remediations, and when they finish one remediation, they then realise actually that information that they started with is out of date again, so they have to start again. So the key thing there is if there is a remediation exercise, make sure you've got your ongoing refresh process ready to work effectively from the end of that remediation so that you can keep that up to date and you don't have to keep going back to do it. And then increasingly we're seeing firms using technology to try and reduce that manual effort. So using tools where you can monitor the changes in data from public websites and regulatory registers and things like that, because really the scale of doing this manually is massive, and there has to be a better way to do it. In relation to transaction monitoring, as I said, it's been the highest area of expenditure over 10 years, with satisfaction going down. Conversion rates outside of the retail banking space are still extremely low. And my view is that in retail banking, transaction monitoring is not really identifying suspicions, it's identifying unusual behaviour. And because in retail you have less detailed information about your customer's business, things tend to get reported because you can't explain something that's unusual, and that's why we have banks submitting tens of thousands of these every month. Within the wholesale space, you've got more information, but the tools are less mature to try and do that. And our survey revealed over 50% of respondents said that that less than 1% of the alerts generated from transaction monitoring systems resulted in a suspicious activity report. So 99% of the work that's being done is for no benefit at all, because it doesn't generate a genuine suspicion. On the flip side, I think the reason that's come about is because in the past regulators have been satisfied with a statement that a transaction monitoring system is in place and haven't necessarily challenged the rules and the setup of that system and what it was achieving. That's changing. Regulators are themselves and also appointing skilled persons to go in and have a look at the rules and lifting the bonnet of the black box that is the transaction monitoring system. So it's no longer good enough to have a system that you've plugged in and started using. They will now look at those, the setup of it, the rules that you've got in there, and the effectiveness and conversion rates. And if they're seeing less than 1%, I suspect they'll be starting to ask some questions. So these areas continue to be a challenge. They continue to shine through in the results of the survey, and we continue to see it in terms of what the regulators are doing, what they're doing on site, and the on-site inspections are increasing and continue to focus on KYC as well as other areas of the AML program.
Right, thank you very much. Some good insights, some of it a bit scary, I think, at times, looking at where we are. So, Kate, we've had a number of respondents so far onto these.
You will see on your slide now a question, an interactive poll. We'd like you to give your answer, and then Gary and our panellists will discuss the results afterwards. So you have about 20 seconds just to type in your answer.
Okay, so maybe whilst we're just waiting for that, I think it's I can't help myself but respond to it. It's interesting this how people measure the successes of their transactional monitoring systems. I was talking to a colleague before this event, and we were saying, maybe the way that success is measured is something it would be useful to hear from attendees today. That as saying that if you look at the maths which sit behind it, which may not be everybody's immediate default to do so, is at the end of the day we are doing statistical maths probabilities.
Yeah.
And the sort of approach we take in a compliance is it is different from that we would take from a marketing perspective, or from a trading perspective, to look at a trend, to look at something that is abnormal, as you pointed out, Brian. It is unusual, and therefore is it suspicious. And it may be useful to solicit some response from people during today's session. So the results are in, as they say. So 33%. The rate of change is so fast it's impossible to accurately budget. Organisations have a wait and see approach, 21, to reduce costs. I'm just going to draw comment from people on that. I think this is something I know I looked at, is that, you know, if not to position the management versus the workers here, but it's kind of, if we are given a bigger budget, there's generally a feeling that people will go and spend it. That is human nature. I think when we're going through a budgetary process ourselves, we go through them here at Thomson Reuters on immense regularity. So I think there's a natural inertia in that maybe if we just sort of, you know, the desire to reduce costs is seen throughout. But maybe about this rate of change is so fast it's impossible to accurately budget. I guess the regulators are not going to accept any statements along those lines that, you know, we couldn't recruit or position people for those reasons.
No, and I think one of the things that we see at the moment is that the pace of change, it's not, for me, it's not just the pace of the change, it's the way that change is coming about as well.
Okay.
So I think if you look, and primarily you're looking at US and UK regulators in terms of the way they approach this, I think what we're seeing now is policy changes by way of enforcement cases in a way that we haven't really seen before.
Right.
So I've been involved in a number of the FCA enforcement cases, and there are statements, and people will recognise these, there are statements in the final notices now, and it's the same in the US with the cease and desist orders, where financial institutions look at those and they say, we didn't realise that was the expectation. Similarly with the on-site visits and the theme reviews, there are statements coming out in those which are, the regulators will say, are statements of what the expectation has always been,
right,
but it's different to what everybody has been doing and has understood. And to give you an example of that, I think the classic one, which actually came out of the 2010 high-risk client review in relation to PEPs, is that the FCA has a view that for clients that qualify for simplified due diligence, so regulated and listed firms, where historically everyone has been getting proof of regulation, proof of listing, the FCA, after that theme review, said, but you should be getting a list of all of the directors of an entity where it's regulated or listed and screening them for PEPs. Because if there's a PEP on the board of a regulated or listed company, it might affect the risk.
right.
Now they pulled back from their original statement on that, which everyone said, well, hold on a minute, you know, a lot of the major banks have got ex-politicians and people on the board, and it has no impact on the risk whatsoever. But they have a handful of cases, largely in relation to listing and companies that they don't like, who are UK listed, where they say, well, look, clearly the risk is higher. So there are firms out there who have been told by the regulator, you've got to go and do this, and have gone on and done it, and that's a good area of where you wouldn't have thought you had to go and get the directors for all of those listed and regulated companies,
right,
and now there's a huge expenditure. And there are others who have said, we're not doing that, and push back.
Thank you very much. I wouldn't. I'd also like to just on that last response say at least 17%. I was exaggerating. Felt it wasn't under budgeted in their organisation. So I think that's good news.
Yeah.
So I know compliance people were sort of often not focusing on the good news, but that was good news. So the next question which we have here: how effective is your AML and ABC training yes, the anti-bribery and corruption training? If we get some of the responses in from that.
We'll just give you 20 seconds to collect your responses.
Thank you very much. I wonder, again, maybe Rowan and Brian, in terms of some of the overheads from that KYC, are you seeing any evidence of collaboration across organisations rather than each company having to do their own, where they're, I'm not going to use the word outsource, but maybe look at some aggregation if it's just the same organisation being qualified, or same customer, let's say, being qualified by many organisations? Is there not a kind of almost a a role there for a central body?
That's a hot topic at the moment, and
Okay.
there are numerous initiatives to try and achieve that, and different. The problem at the moment is that different banks aligning with different people who want to set up a centralised KYC utility, and each of the people who are trying to do it are trying to do it at the moment for a particular part of the market.
Right.
So it's quite a confused picture at the moment. But I have to say I've never seen the impetus the way it is now
Right.
from major banks saying this is not sustainable. We need to have some sort of shared utility to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. So, how effective is your AML and anti-bribery and corruption training? Could be improved 50%, effective 40%. That's an interesting balance, isn't it? So, from a training perspective, Rowan, any views on that?
Well, yeah. This is always a very difficult question, of course. It's a little bit like asking people, when did you stop beating your wife? You ask someone, how effective is your training? And of course, in a sense, it's human nature to people who are going to say, if you're spending money on training, then there's an inevitability that you're going to say it's either effective or very effective. So I am impressed. I am impressed by the entry here that says it could be improved, because we all know that's a reality, and it's also an honest answer. Again, I really want to stress that the training requirement is something which again has to be reviewed regularly. Also often I've come across cases where you go to a client when it's called in to do some consulting, and you go in and one of the questions you look at is the whole question of training, and you actually find out that the last time any meaningful training was done was actually probably about 2 or 3 years ago, and then the process got shelved. Of course, what they tend to forget is that there is an employee attrition rate in all big institutions, and new clients and new employees are coming in, all of whom need to be trained. They have to face the legal requirement. But of course, as is so often the case, when money's tight and times are hard, the training budget is almost inevitably the first one that takes the hit. And so there is this constant, if you like, conflict within the institution about trying to balance the needs of training versus the economic cost to the institution.
Rowan, thank you very much. We'll pose the third question here. How satisfied is your organisation with its transactional monitoring systems? And again, as Kate is counting us down for the 20 seconds, maybe just finishing off a topic on the training. How true would you think it is, or it isn't, that maybe some of the training is far too prescriptive and focused on individual yes, no's, could be's, rather than also a good appreciation for what is the intention of required, or is that inappropriate? Do people just need to know how to do the specific task that they're given?
I think there's some very different sets of training with some very different training objectives that institutions use. I think there's and particularly the larger organisations, there is what is often referred to as the sheep dip training, which is we've got to be able to have a number that says everyone has been trained this year in AML, and they are usually done by computer-based training, and you flick through, and there may or may not be a test at the end that you've got to pass, but if there is, quite often it's not a particularly challenging test. You can do it several times. You can get the answers from the person who sits next to you, which is what happens in a lot of the trading desks. So there's that type which is designed to cover everybody. I think what we're seeing is there is much more focus now on role-specific training, which tends to be more classroom-based, tends to be much more focused on the specific risks of a particular role, and tends to have a lot more engagement because people are more interested in it. So, but those two are often seen in the same organisation, because you need to have that number that you wave around saying everyone's been trained, and the effectiveness of the role-specific training, which is a smaller group of people, is actually doing what you want to.
I totally agree with that. I was once invited to review the training for a group of traders in a derivatives house, and one of the things that staggered me was the way in which every single one of them had managed to pass, and they'd all managed to pass with the same grade, which kind of seemed a little bit suspicious. But when I dug a little bit deeper into it, I found that every single one of the traders in the room had paid a few quid to one of the girls in the back office to do their exams for them, which, that's the way it is. Unfortunately, doing it on computers is often the way it happens.
So, how satisfied is your organisation with this transactional monitoring system? Well, we're looking at about 80% are satisfied, partially satisfied. So that's a fairly unanimous result there. The 5% and 14% not satisfied. Any particular conclusions on that we can think of before we go to the next question?
Well, I would be interested if any of our audience are able to say. I think the not satisfied element is the one that really worries me, because these days, as we all know, the number of and the variety of transaction monitoring facilities that are available seriously cover the waterfront. And so if we've got friends here who are not satisfied with that system they're using, then I'd be very interested to know what it is about the system that's not helping them.
Well, let's go to that question and find out if we're happy to push that out there, Kate.
Yes, you have got about 20 seconds to answer the question on your screen, and we can discuss the answers.
Thank you very much. So the drum roll commences.
I think the other thing to say with some of that is there's a lot of people who have a transaction monitoring system in place. It's doing something, it's generating results, and they haven't necessarily been challenged on them. I think where we're seeing people perhaps change their mind is when actually somebody does come in and say, well, what's it really doing? What are the conversion rates? And actually, when you get that challenge, a lot of people go, actually, it's not doing quite what I thought it was doing. There is a regulatory insurance policy, or there used to be a regulatory insurance policy in having a recognised name as a transaction monitoring system. And as I said earlier, I think that's starting to go away. It's starting to be looking under the bonnet.
So, systems not doing what we want them to do. Transaction monitoring arrangements are poorly documented. That's an interesting one. Hard to demonstrate the effectiveness of the system. Definitely relates to that.
Definitely.
Limited ongoing monitoring. Okay. Other. 22% other. Right. That's a big chunk, isn't it?
Yes, in a sense. I mean, I can only speak from my own personal experience here, and I'd be interested to hear what Brian has to say. But certainly, one of the issues I get back all the time when talking about, I mentioned it myself, one of the issues is this whole question of the burden that false positives places on the department. Because if you're a conscientious department, in theory that you should be chasing down the false positives as well. But of course, that in itself places an immeasurable burden, and there's a huge cost involved. And it's one of my own personal bête noirs is that I'm constantly trying to find ways of helping institutions to minimise this false positive issue. So that would be a very interesting point to know if one day we can get that one answered.
Okay, so on to the number 4. So how confident are you that organisations can demonstrate the effectiveness of its AML compliance programme to the regulator? So again, 20 seconds to respond on that, but I think this is very much comes up to Brian's point that it's no longer the insurance policy that's not going to be challenged. you're going to have to demonstrate what you've done, and you're going to have documentary evidence that you've done it.
Yeah.
I know from when we discuss with clients, we talk about a 3D approach, which you've got to first design, document, and deploy.
Yeah.
And that is a mantra we've had, I think, for over 10 years. Is really you do without that evidence. You've almost no mitigation whatsoever.
Right. I mean, it goes back to the old detectives adage, which is, when as a detective you were interviewing somebody who you suspected, and Chummy would be protesting innocence, and the answer always was, "Don't tell me, show me."
Right. Okay, so we got thank you. So again, confident and neutral, very confident. So quite a good bit above the waterline there, which is great to see.
I think part of this will depend on the definition of demonstrate.
Right.
So I think if it's explain, I think most people would say, yeah, I'm confident I can explain the effectiveness of my program. In terms of demonstrate, what you're expected to have now is not just the documentation of key decisions and things like that, but now an assurance program over your controls.
Right.
That gives you positive evidence that those controls are working as expected. So if the regulator comes in now and says, how do you know that your systems are working properly, they're expecting you to say, because they were tested last month, or they were tested 6 months ago, and we did these tests, and this is what we found, and it showed everything's working okay. If you say, because we implemented it and we did this and the other, and we haven't looked at it since, that's no longer going to be enough. So I think there's different levels of demonstrating effectiveness, and I think the assurance program is the key one. You have to have an assurance program over the controls these days in order to satisfy that requirement.
Can I just add a point there that, I mean, it's very interesting. Brian is talking about the onus of responsibility that's on the institution to demonstrate the effectiveness of their systems. One of the areas of concern I also have, which is, and I'm sure, Brian, you wouldn't shrink from this, is that there is a responsibility also on the regulator to be able to provide inspectors and compliance inspectors who themselves have a good knowledge and a good understanding of what is considered to be the best practice. Because it has to be said that in some of the cases I've come across, clients, I have believed them, I absolutely believed them when they said the regulator came in, and frankly I wasn't certain that in the course of our inspection, I wasn't certain that he or she really had a full hands-on knowledge of what I was required to do.
Yeah.
So I think there's a dual-edged, double-edged sword there, which I think has to be handled with sensitivity, because we're dealing here in very complex areas. And I think we're still in the process of development in these, so if you like, legal philosophical areas.
Okay.
We've got the last question now, but while we are collecting the results, perhaps Gary, you could ask some of the questions that we've had come in from the audience to our panelists.
Happy to do that, Kate. Thank you very much. There's a couple that are directed specifically to Brian and Rowan. Which is putting you on the spot a little bit, so I do apologise for that. We've had one regarding the latest PEPs and low-risk clients. Do you agree with the FCA proposal?
Yes, I think there's two questions there which are around the comment that I made about the FCA saying that you've got to have a list of directors and you've got to screen them from PEPs, whether that's the right approach, whether I agree with it, and whether I think that should be what people are implementing. I think the short answer is there's no right answer to that, because it depends on whether you're prepared to push back to the FCA. But what I advise my clients to do in that situation is to do something that is more than blindly following and saying something's listed or regulated, and therefore I've got proof of listing and regulation, and I don't have to go any further. but something that doesn't go as far as to say, I'm going to get a list of directors for every single listed and regulated company, and I'm going to screen those for PEPs. And that might sound like a bit of a cop-out, but to give you an idea of what I mean by that, there are other risk factors in relation to listed and regulated companies, which are to do with where they're incorporated, where their operations are, the type of business that they're doing. So if you are doing simplified due diligence, one really important thing, simplified due diligence does not mean low risk. And that's an area where a lot of firms go wrong. They put all their simplified due diligence cases into the low risk bucket, and that is the wrong way to do it. You should assess the risk of a simplified due diligence entity, an entity that qualifies for simplified due diligence, and where the risk is higher, you should then consider going and getting things like directors and things like that. So that for me is the right approach, where you say it's simplified due diligence and it's low risk, therefore we're not going to do any more. If we are aware that there's a PEP associated with it, you do need to do something with that. So if you have information that suggests there's a PEP associated, you should consider that. But don't routinely screen all the directors of that low-risk simplified due diligence entity. For an entity that's not low risk, and certainly for an entity that is high risk but still qualifies for simplified due diligence, you absolutely should be doing more. But actually, in that case, it goes beyond just getting a list of directors and screening them. You're talking about actually doing some proper enhanced due diligence, background checks, all those sorts of things. So I think align simplified due diligence with risk, and for the higher risk ones, do something more.
Thank you very much, Brian. So, Rowan, I think another question that we've got in here along the KYC lines is, do source of wealth and funds have to be verified regardless of the risk posed by the client?
Yeah, this is a kind of chicken and egg situation, really. In many respects, the risk posed by the client is in fact determined by the source of the wealth and the funds that he or she has to offer the institution. So if the person concerned gives all the impression, I think this goes back to the point Brian was just making, which is that although on the first cut it might look as if the client was a low risk customer, that doesn't mean, and it certainly does not exonerate you from making sure that you know the source of the wealth and where the funds are coming from. Now that doesn't mean if you've got a low risk, someone you've defined as a low risk customer, oh, and by the way, you've well documented your reasons for saying it's a low risk customer, then that would enable you to be able to, in my view, it would enable you to be able to take a lesser degree of evaluation, but you still have to make sure you know where the money's coming from, where the wealth is coming from, and the sources of the wealth. It does not exonerate you from the level of due diligence that you ought properly to be making.
Okay, Rowan, thank you very much for that. So in terms of what is your organization's biggest priority for customer identification monitoring in 2014? Implement a risk-based approach, so that seems to have resonance, has resonance out there. Streamline processes. I'm very encouraged. Not complacent,
yep.
but I think those are key. Track regulatory change, again, a 12% aspect on that.
Can I speak to that? That track regulatory changes, that goes back to the point we were looking at a little earlier on about, because many of you said that it was very hard to predict regulatory change. Within your risk division, within your risk department, you really ought to have somebody who is there, not just monitoring risk on the various holistic and mathematical basis, but you also ought to have somebody in there who's actually dealing with legal, regulatory and administrative risk issues, so that you've got someone who can flag up the potential changes that are coming down the dust pipe, and be able to put some kind of structure on the skeleton. I mean, it's because, remember, no regulator, no regulatory agency or body hides themselves under a bush. There's plenty of flagging up about where potential changes are coming from. I mean, the FATF, if you want to go and have a look at their website is a massive source of information. And you will see in there the proposed potential changes that they're thinking about. And a short analysis paper of what kind of difference this might make to your business, which could be produced fairly swiftly, might in the longer run save you a great deal of money and pain and suffering if you're seen to be ahead of the game. And again, that would be seen by regulators as taking a proactive approach to providing best practice.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, some of the other questions that came in, and I'm selecting these based on the broader appeal rather than we've got some very specific questions which we thank you for, and I think we're going to be able to come back to you after this event. Is that right, Kate?
Yes, we'll collate all the questions afterwards, and we can get back to you with a reply as necessary.
So just to take those which may have the broader appeal. So again, putting Brian on the spot here, we've got a question which is asking what is the best way to convey the message of the importance of KYC and KYC refresh and monitoring to senior management and our boards?
Well, I think So the main thing that scares senior management and the board in this area is regulation and regulatory penalties. So I think it's naive of us to think that we might educate senior management and get them bought into this from a social responsibility point of view. It's really the fear of regulatory sanction that makes the difference. What I think has changed recently is the focus on individuals as opposed to the firm. And again, there's nothing really that gives focus for senior management more than being personally held accountable and personally on the spot. And to give you the two specific examples, and again, I'll use a US and a UK example, which are different approaches but the same issue. So in the US, US regulators have said they are going to start going after individuals. They feel that going after companies is not having the right deterrent effect because companies absorb the fines and the bad press. They are going after individuals. The Brown Brothers Harriman case is the first example of them doing so. I don't think that MLRO would have been part of a disciplinary case probably 6 months, a year ago.
Wow.
I think we will see in the US pretty much every AML disciplinary case having an individual named and accountable and fined personally as well, which raises the stakes. In the UK with the FCA, pretty much everything in regulation at the moment comes with an attestation. If there's an issue in your organisation, they will immediately say they want a member of senior management personally named as the person who's going to fix it, and then they will ask for that person to sign an attestation once it's fixed, telling them that it's fixed. Now, the reason they're doing that is because the FCA has long said they want to go after individuals and haven't been able to.
Right.
So what they're doing now is they're lining it up. They're basically saying, right, we will have this individual, you will sign to say everything's fixed. Often they will then follow that up by sending a skilled person in to check that it's fixed. And if it's not, they will say, well, your assurance that you gave us was wrong. And what we're seeing is that really focuses the mind of senior management, of that person in senior management, because whereas the board collectively might say, we will sign on behalf of the firm on the basis of a report that says everything's okay, an individual will say, no, I actually want to go in and have a look and make sure that's okay. So the framework they put in place to get the positive evidence that everything is okay is way in excess of what they would do if they were holding the firm to account. So in the UK, it's attestations. They will be subject to attestations if there's a problem, and they'll be on the hook. In the US, they could be subject to the disciplinary fines just because something's gone wrong and they're responsible for it.
Well, that's not a very comfortable note to finish today's conversations on, but I think it's a bit of I'm sure it's not a jolt to most people on the call. It's possibly a jolt to people who we have to go and then communicate this information to. And absolutely valid question. I think we've been asked that question persistently over a number of years, and I'm sure you see it, Brian, when you're talking to organisations, and certainly Rowan. I think it's certainly. It's assisting the role of the compliance teams, and when we're asking for budget and when we're asking for attention. I've got certainly lots of evidence, and I'm sure both of you have got even more so of how much authority is now put into that role as we're going through. Well, I think we're at the top of the hour. Well, I know we're at the top of the hour and just through it. We'd like to thank our two panellists, Rowan Bosworth-Davies and Brian Dilly, for joining us today. Thank you very much for that. A sunny day here in London, which is also a joy as well. Thank you everybody for joining the webinar today, and we will follow up with additional responses to these questions. Kate?
Yes, I'd just like to reiterate what Gary said. A big thank you to all our speakers today. I'm sure you'll agree with me that the session was very informative, and you can take a lot away from it. Just to let you know, we will send everyone who attended this webinar an email with a link to the presentation and recording. So please look out for that in your inbox in the coming days. And yes, just once again, a big thanks for all your attendance, and hopefully we'll be organising lots more webinars similar to this. Thank you.